So Chet asked us to talk about businesses as agents of change. And I will tell you a little bit more about our story, which is you'll be hearing and seeing all three of the folks at Grit who work with companies, growth companies, and we really work to find companies and entrepreneurs, discover what their needs are, and again, act as that intermediary to give them the resources that they need to grow. So Jonathan and I first met through Rick Webb, who you'll hear from after lunch, and it was only through the conversations we were having with founders and those kind of the conversations that happen in the margin at our co-working space that I really began to see how much we had in common. At our very core, altruism is how we approach our interactions with our partners, with our companies, and in general, the way that we interact with our fellow humans. And so what you'll see in all of these as we talk about social impact, we may be talking about entrepreneurship, we may be talking about economic development, but at the core, it's still a human relating to a human at every level, and that's how change happens. So what we'll discuss today are our fundamental beliefs and the makings of a servant leader heart, as well as the role of community and the explicit and implicit values that are in that. People and motivation, transformation, what we see as a model for maintaining momentum, and then we'll get into what I'm most excited about talking about, and that's real stories about how we've seen change occur and how value has been created where before there was none. And then we'll talk about recommended resources so you can continue scholarship on this subject because you can really delve into so many pieces of it. Jonathan, do you want to talk about the core beliefs and values?
We were having this conversation as we were working on this and just talking about servant leadership. I didn't grow up in America. I grew up in Liberia, West Africa. That's where I was born. I didn't come to America until I was 22. And I heard a little bit about this guy named Jesus over there, and I learned about, a lot about him here too. And then when we talk about this servant leadership principle, based on his life and how he served his father. But anyway, as we began talking about this, and we started talking about just the fundamentals of it, we started talking more about, everybody has something to contribute. And I've seen that in my life, not only as a parent, but I also saw my parents sacrifice a lot for me to be what I am today, and I'm doing the same thing for my kids. And my hope is that as I sacrifice and lead and guide them, that they too will become productive citizens that will contribute to the betterment of society, and so that, I think, for me began to tie into, or just gave me the basics, and I think as we discussed and agreed upon, that is the foundation upon which servant leadership is based as we begin to empower, equip, and let others take on that role that we've passed on to them.
So Jonathan and I have had many of these deep conversations, and we've tried to condense this. And again, everyone has the power to drive change as a fundamental. And before anyone can be asked to contribute, they have to have a feeling of belonging. And then finally, if we're successful in what we're doing, it's self-perpetuating across generations. And so when we talk about raising our kids, and when you talk about the true value in life, it calls to mind this metaphor of the most radical act of optimism is planting a tree, knowing that you may never sit in its shade. And it's very much about, as servant leaders, how do we look at the long-range vision for our communities while addressing the needs now, and then figuring out how we develop others to then become servant leaders themselves. And of course, at the heart of that, you've got compassion, humility, love, honesty, and then the one determinant is that concern for others. So I wanted to point to the parallels between entrepreneurship and also servant leadership. So as you can see, the definition is really the same, but if you make a few substitutions, the same concept relates on both sides. So entrepreneurship, broadly recognizing the commercial potential of an innovation or invention, and then gathering the talent, the resources, the capital to make sure that becomes viable. If you apply that same concept to servant leadership, instead of looking at invention, you're really recognizing what's the transformative potential in a person that you're wanting to lead, and then how do I surround that person, again, with the resources, the talent, and the capital so that they themselves can be empowered to become servant leaders. So that's the virtuous cycle. So when we talk about defining community, we've talked about that in a number of ways. And of course, the trend is that community is constantly changing. So in this age where we are constantly in this disruption, which has equal parts exciting notions to it, but equal parts fears, innovation kind of talks about this idea of creative destruction. So if we can properly harness what happens in technology and help empower others through the internet and different things like that, we also realize, and you hear from an economic development perspective, that there are winners and losers. So if we create something that's new and helpful to others, there are other people who are getting displaced from what has previously been places of either employment or value. And so as we change, we have to also empower people to change and be resilient with those things. So what's the distinction between a group? We're a group of people geographically gathered in this room, but are we truly a community? So according to Charles Vogel, he wrote a book called Community, and he kind of breaks down the principles of belonging. And so a group of people they share values, but on top of that, to be a true community, they have to have concern about the other's welfare. And so to put it simply, it's care. So you've all heard possibly, no one cares about what you know unless they know you care. And that happens in terms of the culture of a community that's ever more present. And the distinction is, if you're a group, but you're only looking out for yourself, then you're really just a group. You're not a community. So again, these are tactics that we're learning on being able to transform groups of people, finding similarities and also empowering them to care about one another. So Jonathan, again, had a very interesting point about what's the critical juncture in a community to spark these kinds of changes and to start figuring out how to self-organize in order to become change agents of themselves. In this picture, you'll see an event called Woman Run. It was started by an IP attorney in Rogers, and what she found was there's this common thread of women inventors who would come to them and they would have questions about their business, but they would keep stalling out for one reason or another. She would refer them to resources, but for some reason, something was keeping them from getting the help they needed to take their business from idea to commercialization. And so what she realized, and without making any judgments on what was holding those women back, she realized that there was an opportunity to create a community and bring those resources to the women. And so Women Run is when she brings in women entrepreneurs, she brings in women investors, she brings in anyone that's part of that value chain, and then she gives people an open forum to ask questions. But I know Jonathan has got some examples about this as well, and also can tell you more about what he thinks is important about a community.
Growing up in Africa, and sorry I'm going African on you here today, but it's just one of those deals. I think that I had a lot. I learned a lot. I had a good foundation growing up over there. I learned a lot, and so when I looked at my mom and my grandmother and just how we did life, I always describe doing life in Africa as just survival. We are trying to just do life every day. But what I saw the women do, and there was a concept, I think, that is one of those things that's really interesting that's in different parts of the world, called different things. The Susu concept in Liberia was something that the women came together. And in that coming together, it was about first trust, right? Trusting each other and making sure that when they did come together and you have a leader in that group that would then, they would put money together whatever that the amount they had, if it's $50, $25, $100, those women, and again, understanding that they didn't have access to capital, they didn't have access to banking, they didn't have access to anything of that sort, and they were trying to build businesses, they were trying to change their communities, and they were trying to change the lives of their kids. And a lot of the times, I think what we're learning today, when the women in Africa are working, the family is better off because they're putting what they've sacrificed and what they've put together towards the family, bettering the lives of the kids, educating the kids. So the women will come together and put their money together. And this process worked that one person, after everything was gathered, would get that money, and those women will usually invest it in something else, if it's a business or education. And I saw my grandmother invest hers in bread making, and that's what supported my grandmother. She built 2 homes, and she did all of this with this money that was being gathered, these women coming together. But it was a concept that continues today here in America with a lot of us foreign nationals that are here. If we lack access to banking, we come together, we pool money together, and that concept goes from one person to the other. And that, in turn, changes the community. So it was just how we sometimes figured out ways to change, to impact the communities that we were living in and change the lives of our kids and everybody else in that community.
So that's what entrepreneurs do, right? They find workarounds. Entrepreneurs, innovators, servant leaders are very good about figuring out where the gaps are, where the challenges are, where the opportunities, and then in a very scrappy fashion, figuring out how to organize, again, the capital, the talent, and the resources to make change happen. So one of the things, again, that Jonathan and I discuss quite a bit is about how do you get people to act? Sure, we all have things that are keeping us up at night, or we've all had that brilliant invention that we see gets commercialized, and the Shark Tank people invest in it, and it's like, I thought about that 10 years ago. But what do we do as people in order to change from where we are now to what we need to be doing to be resilient? So there is an excellent book called Drive. It's by Daniel Pink, and he really talks about the surprising things that motivate us. And what we tend to mistakenly think, a false belief, is that people want external rewards. And sometimes you'll hear that just in a superficial conversation with someone who is looking to do something different or to take a risk. You'll hear most commonly from entrepreneurs or founders is, there's not enough money available to me, or I don't have funding, and that's the major obstacle. But what we have found, and what this book talks about, is that truly people, money matters to an extent to where they have what they need, but once you reach that point, you can set it aside and focus on what really motivates you in terms of what leads to better performance, what leads to higher satisfaction. And the 3 deeply human needs that matter are to be able to direct your own life, to have autonomy, to be able to learn and create new things, so this idea of mastery. And then, of course, this purpose. How do we do better by ourselves and by our world? And that, I think, is where this potential of servant leadership and also impacting change for communities can really, really kind of have this multiplier effect. Because once you become a community, you start to begin to care about the welfare of others. Once you start deepening the relationships and knowing what people want to do and then matching that towards a blueprint for your community at large, that's when you start to become kind of the snowball effect, and you start to see that happen. Because there are lots of rich people who are unhappy, and there are a lot of people who don't have material things that are the happiest people that you'll ever meet. And so my parents are from the Philippines. I was actually born in Arkansas and have only been there once. But a huge part of my upbringing was learning to do a lot with little, and also, again, this idea of survival and building not just for you, but to be able to pass on. It's passing on the possibility and opportunity to your offspring. And so really it's that freedom of choice. So when we talk about transformation, Emergent is actually a Grit Growth member, and I bring them up in this presentation because what they offer to enterprises is a methodology to incorporate design thinking, to incorporate being agile, all the things that I believe economic developers look to the startup way, which is, how do I make my small feedback loops, my learning loops, smaller so that I'm not expending excess effort in a plan that isn't the right product market fit? So how do I make sure that I'm not putting all my resources, all my people, working on a grandiose plan without having talked to my customer or to my user or to my market? And so what they've done is they've really boiled down not just transformation, how do I get from here to there, but also calibrating it towards what the values are of my company, and then also how do I continue to incorporate innovation in a way that's sustainable and becomes a part of the culture of the company. And so the three things that I think are directly relatable in this sense are the mindset, mechanics, and measures. And so when you talk about the strategic plan that Engage NWA has done, when you talk about systemically trying to be more diverse and inclusive in your recruiting practices as a college, there are certain shifts that need to happen. And one of that is in your mindset. And it really is, again, opening up people's ideas to what's possible. So you can't be what you can't see. So if you're able to, as he was saying, bring someone in the recruitment position that looks like the audience that you want to recruit, that has a huge impact, even without saying anything in our literature or having an explicit articulation of what the values are of grit. By virtue of having a West African and a woman of Filipino descent as part of the leadership team, we've seen just by that implication of our values, more diversity in the entrepreneurs that walk in through our door. So again, when you talk about mindset and culture, it's explicit. What do you say you stand for? And it's also implicit in terms of your brand. Who do you spend your money with? How do you answer your phone? How do you greet people? These are all things that we probably don't articulate, but as a community and as a newcomer, people feel that, and that is a huge part of it. Mechanics, so what do I do as a company? So we can talk about mindset, possibility, draft the plan, but then when we talk about mechanics, like what are the systems we have in place? Chet, just outside the door, and I were talking about, okay, how do we do resource mapping, or how do we couch our referrals if we have a small business or an aspiring entrepreneur walking through the door and is looking for help? How do we treat that wayfinding journey? Those are the types of mechanics that can perpetuate what you want to do in terms of your mindset. And then finally, how do we know that we're achieving what we're wanting to do? So at the end of that feedback learning loop, how am I measuring my success? So those are the things that make systemic change possible, and just even the littlest change in an organization or in someone's own servant leadership personal development journey, that's how you make it sticky. So in terms of a momentum model, this is just meant to give you a visualization, and I know it's more on the philosophical side, and we'll bring it home with more concrete examples, but how do you continue to create momentum from an idea to action, especially when you're looking at a regional model? So when you talk about regional model, not only do you have all the traits of diversity that Margot had talked about, it's like diversity in age, diversity in experience, diversity in culture, diversity in many things. So how do you work across those differences and find the strengths in those experiences? And a huge part of that is discovery. So when you look at discovery, it's all about asking and it's all about listening. And so being open and really asking the questions so that you design something that is tailored to the needs of your stakeholders. And then there's the development. That's all about looking at resource alignment and figuring out what does a pilot look like. If we want to set our sights on recruiting more diverse students to the college, then what would be a pilot that looks like that? Would it be a reverse pitch where we have service providers who come from many walks of life talk about how they would like to support the students? And then, so that is development, and then finally it's deployment. So in the startup nomenclature, It's very much like if you're not embarrassed about your first product, then you didn't launch fast enough. So that's very much a part of it. It's like, do not let perfectionism get in your way. Instead, go to market, be embarrassed a little, ask for feedback, and then take in that feedback and make it better. Because as we said, we are all navigating new territory at the same time, and it's a judge-free zone, and it's more so about how do we continue to create value for our citizens and our fellow humans. So Jonathan talked about Susu, and this is one of the greatest examples, I think, in terms of creating trust. So Margot talked about how there's no shortcuts, about how as servant leaders, you are, in a way, brokers of trust. You know, that's how these things happen. And one conversation with Chet, sitting around the table at Grit, then became, you know, 15, 20 introductions to people that I trust, and now he's had those interactions and trust them, and then he's referring people to those folks. And so it's this continuous cycle of getting to know people and then creating those stronger formal and informal network connections. So I am going to ask you to come back up and delve a little bit deeper into Susu, just because I do think it's one of those, this was one of the workarounds. This is not a legal entity. This is really just a bond of trust between humans to do the right thing, and it has had huge economic impact in that respect.
And I was fortunate to go back to Africa after I graduated from college and worked here for a while, and I started working with a nonprofit, and we began to build medical clinics in developing countries. And as I went back, I'm seeing that, you know, here's this beautiful continent devastated just by, you know, AIDS and poverty and everything else, and but yet and still, you have a beautiful group of people that are resilient and wanting more from life, and you know, groups that are coming together to help each other, to pick up the pieces to make communities better. And I think I have written here about trust. You know, trust makes relationships closer, more flexible, more innovative, more willing to share resources, more willing to be vulnerable. And that's the kind of community that I grew up in, that as I went back to Africa, I began to see, and I'm beginning to see more and more of the entrepreneurial minds just coming alive. And one of the other things that I also worked on, I went back to teach leadership in Africa, using sports to teach leadership. And it's a young continent, meaning that I think over 52% of the population is under the age of 15. And when I've seen some of the present leaders not being good example or not passing on good examples, so how do we transform a continent when we've not got good examples and there's no trust, and everyone is pretty much, you know, in it for themselves? And so in taking sports, I began to teach the principles of leadership, because sports, it's a common language. We all speak it, we all do sports, we all have fun at it. And but one of the things that I discovered as I was in Rwanda, I don't know if you all knew, in 1994 there was a genocide, and for 100 days, 800,000 to 1 million people died. And so there was no trust in the culture. And the country began its journey back, and I was part of that journey to help the community come back. And I bought some land there, I had a place there, so I was commuting from the US to Rwanda for work. And but I took a principle, because I saw these young, vibrant, just bright people that were looking for ways to be successful, and they were waiting for Westerners to provide capital for them to do what they wanted to do. And one day I had an interesting encounter. A young man came to my house, asked me for money to get his wife out of the hospital. I paid it, but I couldn't move beyond the ask. So I sat down with the general manager of where he worked and really, truly understood what the challenges were. And it was a cycle of debt that I had forgotten because I was a part of that cycle of debt when I was in Africa, kind of a hand-to-mouth culture. And that's what I continued to see 15 years, after I had been out of Africa, and I came back and saw the same pattern. And so I sat down with this general manager. We talked about the parable of the fish and the loaves. I said, when Christ asked his disciples to feed these people, they said it would take 1 month's wage. But this young kid brought the fish and the loaves and trusted it with the Lord, and he multiplied it. So I sat this guy down and I said, what if you took what God had given you and trusted it to God and see what he does? So I got 6 people together, sat them down and talked to them about, guess who? Dave Ramsey. His Financial Peace University. So we took out of Dave Ramsey's book what wasn't relevant to the culture, right? And then these guys started reading, asking questions, and I answered and helped them put this concept together. And I put up the seed money, and the next thing I knew, this group in this community of 300,000 became the largest depositing group in the community, taking the little resources that they had, putting it away, paying down debt, and eventually building this, amassing all of this revenue. Then I sat them down and I said, okay, now, what are you going to do with what you've been given? How do you transform your community? How do you make a difference in the community? What are the needs in the community that you can change? And then they began to identify different things. So the first thing they did, since lending was an issue, they created a lending fund out of the interest of the money that was being accumulated in the bank. And from there, they began to help people in the community to borrow money. And those people began to open businesses. But that same group started looking at more needs in the community and started tourism business, buying vehicles, because the gorillas lived, a few thousand feet where we all lived, and they were doing tourism, and there were lots of weddings, so they bought vehicles, they bought tents, they bought chairs, and all of that creating jobs in the community, transforming the community. But the key thing was this. After the genocide, there was not trust among the people. So let's go back to what we just said about trust, right? They came together, they trusted each other, and they were lending money, they were being innovative, they were being creative, and they were transforming the community, all because I saw lives being transformed from the inside out. And so that continues to happen, and the people continue to make a difference in the community. And I think that's what, when we talk about being a community, I believe that's what being a community is all about. And I'm seeing it work here too in the U.S. in different places. As I worked at Walmart, helping to diversify the supply chain, taking opportunities to minority, giving them access to opportunity. They're changing communities because they're creating jobs and creating impact.
So I've got 2 more examples for you before we open up to questions. So this is Damara Baker. She's from Venezuela, and she is a rockin' baker. That's what she has as the name of her bakery, and also her academy. And so she is one of the few B Corps that we have in Arkansas. So she's a for-benefit corporation, and then she also runs the academy as a nonprofit. And what she saw was there is a neurodiverse workforce, but there are also people who are in tough transitions. So these are people who are maybe transitioning out of food insecurity. Perhaps they're homeless, perhaps they've been incarcerated and are now out in the community looking for their first opportunity for work. And she also had a passion for bread making. And so naturally leavened, European, artisanally made bread. And so what she did was she took her learnings on both sides, and at the intersection of that passion, she created the Rockin' Baker Academy. And so she has cadet bakers who come in, and at the same time that she's teaching the mechanics of bread making and also the back of the house business of being a wholesale supplier to different restaurants in Northwest Arkansas and in Central Arkansas, she's also bringing a layer of career readiness and workforce development by leaning on community resources to help people become ready to either start their own business or simply have the confidence to become a part of another business or to do a different small business. So she's really using almost this apprenticeship model on top of an accelerated model with education and training to transform the lives of individuals. And so that's another excellent example of someone thinking about what their values are, looking at the passion that leads them, and then matching it with a community gap. And then just last night at Black Apple Crossing, which is in Springdale, Margot, Aaron Shelton, and also Monica Kumar, who's with the Endeavor Foundation, put together what I think is a really lightweight and inspiring and powerful model to be able to hear from multiple people and to hear their journey. So we saw a gap in the different offerings. Like if you're at a networking event, you exchange business cards, everyone is always pressured to give their 60-minute pitch or their elevator pitch to tell people who they are and what they do. And we often mistake what people do for who they are. And so what we wanted was the ability to hear people's backstory. So we looked at individuals in the community who were driving change, and we asked them to put together 20 images, and at each image there would be 19 seconds. So with every image it auto advances. So after 19 seconds, you really get at most like 6 1/3 minutes to hear about this person. But the challenge we gave them was to tell us about, give us a personal lens. So what were the different kind of moments in life, pivotal moments, epiphanies? It may have just been about their upbringing or where they're from, anything that they deemed to be important and special about what shaped them into the change maker that they are today. And so we heard from a dancer who'd recently moved from Boston to here in order to organize our arts and regional effort. We heard from a citizen of the Marshallese community. We heard from the CEO and president of the Northwest Arkansas Council, who served in the White House and the Department of Homeland Security. We heard from a man who is from Mexico City who loves art but also directs a social innovation program, and about how soccer has really defined his philosophy on life. We heard from someone who had struggled through his transgender journey and how that made him feel like a marginalized or a person who felt out of place in his southern town, and how he was able to overcome that to be able to find a place where his voice was appreciated and heard. And so these were all, and also we had a musician from Puerto Rico who came here to play music, but instead was called to using music to teach people in schools about, again, to get away from fighting and using music to be mentors. Who did I leave out? Monica started Bentonville Soup, and she was very much about community engagement, and she saw an opportunity to have a micro-granting dinner. So anyone can walk in the door. They have 4 minutes to talk about what change they would like to see in the community or in their neighborhood, and people who attend pay a suggested donation, and they bring potluck food. Everyone hears the presenters, and at the end, people vote to where all the pot of money from the admissions will go to in order to advance that project. Again, like the Susu, these are lightweight ways to hear from citizens, learn what's important to them, and also empower them to make those changes. So hopefully we've given you some equal parts philosophy, equal parts real stories and case studies, and then what motivates people, what's transformation, how do we continue momentum, and then finally, I'm going to give you some suggested reading. So these are the books where a lot of the concepts that we espouse in the way that we work with the community, a lot of those values and ideas. If you want to kind of delve more deeply, Drive by Daniel Pink. The Rainforest, you'll hear more about that when Rick talks about ecosystem, but we also have a more beautiful question in The Art of Community. So with that, I'll open to questions. Thank you.